Okay, I'm Katie Stone, and welcome to my Psychedelics talk. This is Psychedelic Midwifery, Conceiving a Post-Renaissance Paradigm, or Why I Didn't Go to Med School. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground today, so strap in. First, I'll situate you into my particular fields of study. Then I'll walk you through my psychedelic-inspired transition from a non-spiritual type A pre-med to an aspiring psychedelic midwife. Finally, I'll conclude with where my research focus has landed, and we'll consider the value of exiting the Renaissance as we conclude. But first, a few important frameworks. So rather than working with psychedelics from an anthropocentric psychology, I draw from ecopsychology, which emerged to help us find our way back to the awareness that we are the earth, having a human experience, and that we are a part of and not a part from nature. One primary lesson of ecopsychology is reciprocity, which requires autonomy, compassion, and hospitality. This lesson is beautifully illuminated in the relationship between mother and child in the womb and in the web of life, evident across all ecosystems. One of the primary goals of ecopsychology is to help support the birth of an ecological self rather than an egological self. And my story will help demonstrate some of that. So the next part we'll talk about is transpersonal sociology. And remember, sociology emerged to help us understand social facts. And these facts are used to describe social structures that shape the realities that we experience. In transpersonal sociology, we emphasize how transpersonal encounters, such as psychedelic use or childbirth, sort of impact our daily face-to-face interactions, but all of those are mediated by the social structures that we live in. So if psychedelics are going to change the world, this is the field that it's going to play out in. And the question is how and to what end? So in our discussion, we'll be focusing on the microsocial structures found around the transpersonal experience of childbirth and how that shapes society. The bottom line to remember here is that there's no universal birth experience and no universal psychedelic experience, even though both dive into transpersonal realms. The question to ask is what experiences you are integrating and how you are doing that, with which templates and models, and why. To an extent, we get to choose how we integrate our experiences, and that's why for me, I draw from ecopsychology, because it allows me to integrate into an ecological self, like I was mentioning before. Okay, so that's our basic framework. Let's move on to brief note on content warnings. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I do want to preface that I will be talking about abortion in a birth narrative. So if some may find that triggering, feel free to pause if you need to and then come back. And if all of this sounds like too much, here is the TLDR, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so how did I depart my well-planned, perfectly timed life plan? It all started at birth. When I tell my birth story, I'm usually complaining about it because I was a C-section scheduled before Christmas, and I was pretty offended. How do you tell your birth story? Does it start with I was born or my mother gave birth? My mother doesn't get to tell my birth story. She died 5 years after it started, but she did leave it for me in a journal that my father returned to me 27 years after my mom died. The first time I got it, I went to the first page eager to see what she had to tell me from her perspective about my childbirth and how we were relating to each other. These were her words. It's taken a while. I'm finally starting to me like you. And hearing this, I was pretty crushed. It felt like I was losing her all over again because I had lost this entire concept that motherly love was some sort of unconditional, magical, biological guarantee. And as I went to sleep that night, my mind tried to make sense of this new reality that my perfect ideal of a mother didn't exist in my head. So to make sense of that, it threw me a transpersonal experience. And in my dream, I murdered my mom. It was pretty horrifying. And when I woke up in a panic attack, I realized that my entire life I had been reliving hers, following every path that she had taken, following the same jobs and dreams. But if she had died at 36 from cancer because she wasn't taking care of her health and paying attention to her body, I really don't think I wanted to follow in her steps anymore. And I struggled trying to figure out another way to know who she was. It wasn't what I wanted to experience when reading my birth story the first time, and it left me wondering and looking for answers. So of course I turned to spiritual practices with psychedelics and my favorite scholars and began unpacking this archetype of mother as I knew it. There was Mother Earth, the idea of a motherland, but if it wasn't an unconditionally loving and giving and serving person, I didn't know what it was. And so I had to do a little bit of research, not only into my own birth process with the cesarean section, but also into the background of spirituality that I'd never been exposed to. Raised in the Christian church, I had a theological framework, but there was this whole other world of theology around the birth of goddesses and women's health and women's spirituality that I had no idea existed. And I found that the womb keepers of these traditions knew all about the transpersonal dimensions of birth, which I had thought Groff had brought into psychology, but it turns out he didn't discover that any more than Hoffman discovered ergot before isolating LSD. Rather, these were people who were describing wisdom that existed elsewhere and just translating it into a modern framework. So I kept digging and realized I needed to start restructuring how I related to all of this, not just mother, but spirituality and women. The idea of women became important to reconsider. I didn't want to use anything that had gendered roles attached to it. And I just really wanted to find a spirituality that spoke to the archetype of mother and womb and child living in this nurturing relationship. And I wanted to build a relationship with that archetype and use it to help develop my own self in relationship to my transpersonal experiences. So I started looking for examples of the spiritual experiences of women throughout history that were using sacraments like mine, and really didn't take to the idea of entheogen because it had theo in it, and this affinity for God and theology and all of these texts that had been very damning towards women. I didn't want it to get involved in my mental schemes. So I tried to think of something else and ended up deciding I needed to go to grad school to answer all of these questions because I couldn't stop wondering and I needed to do something with my life. So this is where my inquiry started. And as I began experience personal for me, and we ended up coming with entheogen. Seemed like a simple shift, and as I started to write with my research and my integration exercises using this term, I found that it shifted how I related to my use and to the spiritual dimensions and the healing that I was tapping into. So this is what I started with as I was going into grad school. And from here, I had a strong foundation to start integrating a lot of really intense past experiences of trauma. So here's our little story, a little content warning for you too. We're getting into it. Like most women I know, the women, well, women in pre-med studies especially, we've been introduced to the womb as if it were a pathology or a karmic inheritance that caused us to have such painful, miserable periods and cycles. It was supposed to be this religious reminder that we were sinful daughters of Eve, and this was the pain that we were ritualizing every month when a cycle came. And when I left the church in high school and chose to empower myself by using hormonal birth control, I was trying to also then ritualize my independence and autonomy. And I was empowered, but I'd also been lied to about the impacts of the medications that I was taking. At the time, I was on a really strong path after decades of abusive relationships. And I was in my undergrad and hadn't been on mental health medication for 2 years. I was doing extended cycling with my birth control, so I was only having a cycle every 4 months. And that's when I became a statistic. By the time I missed my cycle, I'd been having weird dreams about babies and was deeply and inexplicably depressed. 3 days later, I was in my bathroom with a positive pregnancy test, completely numb. The next day, I was at the student health clinic, still numb, but now confused because the doctor's test came back negative. 3 times I asked her to redo her test, and 3 times she brushed me away, saying her machines were never wrong. She took one look at my mental health history and sent me home with Valium, Clonopin, and Zoloft. But on my way out the door, she did say to have a good summer. I didn't, though, and 2 months later, I was standing at an overpass ready to jump. My dog called me home, and scared out of my mind, I called a friend for help. We arranged for a session that weekend, and I promised to be safe until then. We built our sacred altar space and settled in, and I had hoped to shake loose the roots of my depression, but within the first hour of starting, instead I met the child that was struggling to manifest in my womb. We had a lot to talk about, but the next day I walked to the student clinic and demanded a blood draw, and wouldn't you know it, I was 26 weeks pregnant and things were not okay. 1 week later, I was flying to New Mexico to abort a maldeveloped child. It was nothing like the movies taught. The procedure lasted 5 days. The fetal heartbeat was terminated on day 1. And day 5, my body began to birth the terminated fetus naturally. No painkillers were allowed by law, nor was my family allowed to be present in the room with me. And I was about to learn firsthand that it was pain that was the window to the transpersonal realms of birth. But before we get there, I do want to ask what you all know about the history of pregnancy. Because for me, being that it was a condition, well, of pathology in the uterus, it was supposed to be managed and intervened upon by doctors and surgeons. I was never taught that it could be this transpersonal experience because, well, in my ancestry, the womb keepers and the wisdom healers and every woman that was responsible for building this lineage of oral tradition in healthcare was being slaughtered and put in prison and tortured and completely kicked out of the medical system as men took over the medical guilds that were forming and disallowed women from participating. The systematic elimination of women from these places meant that they were being turned into birth machines and were no longer in charge of their own reproductive health. They've never recovered from this, and it goes all the way back to the Renaissance. Womb wisdom didn't disappear in those years after entirely, but by the early 20th century, birthing women were being drugged and strapped to beds, never remembering that they gave birth at all. And by the 21st century, we were scheduling C-sections around holidays and early, well, mostly for convenience. So women now have babies, they don't give birth in modern US healthcare. What could possibly go wrong though, right? We are taking these childbirth experiences, which could be incredibly transformative, as rites of passage for women, and we're telling them instead to not trust their bodies, to submit them to doctors who are endangering them. And this doesn't just have a health impact, it has a ritual impact on the psyche. And the list of associated traumas is very long. You're welcome to take your pick and follow up on it. But the one that we're going to focus on is more aligned with the loss of natural reproductive health treatment. So throughout history, as we said, up until the Renaissance, there were these social structures that supported women through transpersonal birth rights. And that's great, but I know that it's easy to validate that and to advocate for it, but what about uncommon childbirths? Can we still have transpersonal experiences in an abortion, for example? You tell me. So it was around 5 hours of the 8-hour labor when I thought I was going to die from the pain. And suddenly I was no longer in my body, but thrown into a red desert landscape where I'd encountered two entities against the backdrop. There was the familiar Earth Mother on the ground, and above her in the starlight was someone silhouetted that I'd never encountered before. I didn't know what to call her, so we'll go with the creatrix. And she had an awful lot to say to me when I was in that transpersonal realm, being held by the Earth Mother through the pain of the contractions. With every contraction, she showed me everything the earth had felt with every bomb and every bulldozer and every burning forest. She showed me how my womb was the earth's womb and how both were alchemical vessels for transforming life and updating the genetic code in a way. And intermixed with all of these scenes of earth's destruction were scenes of my own assaults and abusives, as if the earth and my pain were the same, and she was sharing the load with me and we were getting through this together. The creatrix also showed me that life began in the stars, but was acted here out in a living womb, a planet that was like my own womb, where all of this beautiful cosmic mother line was just going back into history. But beyond that, it was going sideways and forward like a quilt circling a family tree. And the final note she left me with was that nurture was the heartbeat of the cosmos. And as I came out of it and returned back to the birthing contractions and one final push, completely admitting self-defeat, I yelled, "I can't." And then the nurse softly responded that I did. And then it was over and the pain was gone and the entities were gone. In the recovery room when I rested, I was reading journals of women who had come before me to the clinic. Many of them were surprised pregnant as I was. They were terrified, horrified, raped, poor, young. All of them were very clear what they were going through and the pain of it, and everyone was empowered to exercise their right, but every single one felt so much shame and stigma. But I didn't want to, and I didn't think I should have to feel that punishment in that kind of way, to the point where it destroyed my ability to be in the world. So if I didn't want to numb it all out, how was I going to integrate something so potentially traumatizing? The worst part about all of this was that the baby would have been due on my dead mother's birthday. No joke, it broke me. So I had to find a way to make sense of it. And that's where spirituality really does come in. It allows us to find processes to integrate the things that are just too much, so that we can still learn to live and be enlivened within a collective and not be isolated in our suffering. So if we can have rites of passage for birth, why not potentially for abortion? Why can't we also think about prioritizing the mother and the women in this process and not just focusing on the shame and stigma that they should be experiencing? It can be different. And so I wanted to think of rites of nurture instead of just the rites of nature in my ecopsychology background, but to bring this into the next level. And that's where I started getting into this idea of psychedelic midwifery. So if we in psychedelic studies were to completely transform reproductive health at the same time that we're transforming mental health, then we would have the opportunity to create some serious systematic social change. And I know that we want millions of therapists to support this transition we're going through, but we also really need midwives. And there's a lot of crossover here that I think we should really investigate, because it's not just that we need midwives, we need people who are able to support an ecological awareness of the world so that we shift where our society is going, and also people who can handle the trauma of the birth experience that we're all collectively, in the US at least, trying to reintegrate. So I know end of life anxiety is important, but I also want to talk about how birth is the other human universal. And I want to add on to the idea of set and setting. Maybe we also think about support, because with midwifery, everything is happening in a team and you're a part of a birthing community. Even the people in the community are part of the process and welcoming the new being that's being born and supporting the mother and the child and integrating into a new space. So I know it could be different. And if we started asking those questions, we'd be asking others, such as what are the impacts of hormones and hormonal therapy on psychedelic dosage and experiences? There's just so much that we're missing by framing it as we always have in the psychedelic renaissance. So ecopsychology is a radical field that demands truth be laid out bare. So I'm sharing the reality of our situation here. This is the maternal mortality rate in the first year of life. And you'll see United States at the very bottom there, 17.4% per 100,000 live births. And this is horrifying. And to me, I mean, it makes so much sense that there's so much fear around birth and where this can head. But it doesn't need to be this way, because with psychedelic midwifery, we have this lineage of folklore. Well, I don't know if you know about the farm. It's one of my favorite stories in psychedelia history. It's a story about a traveling commune who ends up learning in real time that babies don't wait for hospitals and that buses don't make great delivery rooms. And a dozen births later, they ended up finding some neighboring Amish midwives in a farm and realized that women could have transpersonal experiences just like psychedelic experiences while giving birth. And no joke, part of that was orgasmic birth. Orgasms during childbirth. I can't even fathom what a difference between the shackles that my grandmothers were dealing with. But it's not just that the midwives and doulas are helping the birth, they're also helping the community before and after. So we're also talking about psychedelic midwifery in terms of postpartum care. So helping with bonding, helping with attachment issues, and then also maybe even helping women who are terrified of giving birth as a rite of passage, and also women who know that they're approaching abortion or are recovering from abortion. I want to be able to support them in this process using psychedelic therapy and an ecopsychology model to help facilitate that. So instead of winding up the trauma surgeon I thought I was supposed to be, I've landed at a praxis that I think is going to still remove trauma from the body, but just not surgically. And 5 years since that dream where I murdered my mother and began begging this question, what is mother, what is nurture? My wondering lands me here, thinking that the world could be very different, not only if we had had access to psychedelic therapy, but if these tools of transpersonal growth and development that are inherent within the womb were restored and repaired as well in the process. I wonder how it would just start changing our entire relationship with birth and death, our relationship with mother and Mother Earth. And it helps me really dream of different post-Renaissance paradigms we could start getting into that would allow for this to happen. So I want to ditch the baggage of the Renaissance, the baggage of entheogen, the baggage of all of that, and just think of new ways to frame everything. The psychedelic revival is a really fantastic start. I really appreciate this, and it's inspired me to review how I approach all of it. And then the last one that I've been playing with is a psychedelic restoration. So it doesn't have to be a revival. You get to write it. You can choose your own adventure like I did, and you can make up your own process and system for it. your birth story is not the beginning of you. It's just one story in a very long arc of life. And every time you're in those transpersonal realms, you get to reinvestigate that. And I think that's maybe the main message of psychedelic midwifery I want to leave with you, that you are in earth. So I hope that we all live like the kin that we are and weave bodily autonomy and cognitive liberty together for a post-Renaissance paradigm. Thank you.